The night was darker than usual, the kind of night when even the stars seemed to turn their backs on the world. Inside the orphanage, the sound of rain dripping through a broken roof echoed to the dormitory, landing on thin mattresses where children tried to sleep. Among them was Gabriel, a boy with pale skin, dark hair, and piercing blue eyes that carried more sorrow than any child should know. He wasn't supposed to be awake, but hunger and the stench of mold on his pillow kept him restless. His stomach groaned like an empty drum, twisting with pain. He curled into himself, clutching the edge of his threadbare blanket, trying to quiet the gnawing ache. As he lay still, the whispers of other boys cut through the silence. "No one wants him," one boy sneered from the next bed. "Even the families who come to adopt avoid looking at him. They say his eyes are cursed." The group of children snickered, cruel laughter stabbing deeper than any blade. Gabriel shut his eyes tight, pretending to sleep, but tears escaped anyway, sliding down his face and soaking his thin blanket. He pressed his lips together, refusing to let a sound slip out. Crying out loud would only bring more mockery. This was the kind of humiliation he endured every day. At meal times, the staff served him last, often with the smallest portions, sometimes just a scrap of bread while the others ate full bowls of stew. When visitors came, the caretakers pushed him to the back, ashamed of his ragged clothes and cold stare. He was treated not as a child, but as a reminder of abandonment, something no one wanted to carry home. That morning had been particularly brutal. A wealthy couple arrived, their expensive coats dripping from the rain. The director gathered the children in the front hall, each child desperate for a smile, a hand extended, a chance at family. Gabriel stood in the corner, his stomach growling, his heart pounding with fragile hope. Maybe today would be different. Maybe someone would see him. The woman glanced around, her eyes full of judgment. "That one looks weak," she muttered, pointing at Gabriel. "His eyes are unsettling. Let's not waste our time." The man didn't even bother to look at him. They walked past, choosing another child whose laughter seemed brighter, more marketable. The rejection wasn't new, but it sliced Gabriel open all the same. His chest tightened. He felt invisible, as though he weren't even human. That hollow sting followed him for the rest of the day. Later that evening, as punishment for being unpresentable to the visitors, the director made Gabriel scrub the floors on his knees, while the other boys played soccer in the courtyard. His small hands bled from the harsh soap, his knuckles raw against the cracked tiles. Water seeped into his pants, chilling him to the bone. A group of boys passed by, pointing and laughing. "Look at the little servant," one jeered. "No wonder nobody wants him." Another boy added, "Careful, don't look into his eyes too long. They'll bring you bad luck." The laughter grew louder, echoing in the empty hall. Humiliation burned hotter than the sting of his skin. Gabriel lowered his head, biting his lip so hard it almost bled, trying not to give them the satisfaction of hearing him cry. He had learned to hide his pain, at least on the outside. When the director finally dismissed him, the sun had already set. Gabriel sat alone in the corner of the dining hall, staring at the scraps left on dirty plates. He wasn't given dinner that night. Hunger gnawed at him so fiercely that he considered licking the crumbs, but he forced himself to resist. Pride was the only possession he had left. That night, as the dormitory grew silent, Gabriel finally allowed himself to whisper into the darkness, one day I'll show them I'm not worthless. One day they'll know my name." It was a fragile promise from a boy the world had discarded, but it was all he had. That vow would carry him through storms, through hunger, through years of loneliness. For now, though, Gabriel remained the orphan nobody wanted. The boy mocked for his strange eyes, the boy used for chores, the boy whose dreams seemed impossible. But somewhere, deep inside the boy drenched in humiliation and rejection, a seed had been planted, a determination that even the coldest orphanage could not kill. And though he didn't know it yet, that same boy would grow to stand in a courtroom one day, dressed in the robe of justice, with the power to decide the fate of others. That night, as thunder rolled outside, Gabriel closed his swollen eyes and whispered again, this time louder, as if daring the universe to hear him, "I will not be forgotten." The mornings in the orphanage began not with warmth or comfort, but with a harsh clang of a rusted bell. Gabriel awoke to familiar draught sneaking through the cracked windows, the thin blanket clinging to him useless against the cold. He rubbed his eyes, still swollen from crying, and rose before the others stirred. For him, mornings meant chores before food, if food ever came. The routine was humiliating. While other children were allowed to linger, Gabriel was ordered by the director to fetch water from the pump outside. The pump handle was stiff, icy against his small fingers. He pulled with all his strength, shivering as the cold water splashed over his bare arms. By the time he carried the heavy bucket inside, his shoulders ached, and the older boys were already seated at the table. Breakfast was porridge, thin, watery, often cold before it was served. The staff placed bowls in front of each child, but Gabriel's portion was always smaller. When he protested once, the director snapped, "Be grateful we feed you at all. You should work harder if you want to eat like the others." That morning, one of the boys, Matus, scooped a spoonful from his own bowl and deliberately dropped it onto the floor. "Here, dog," he said, smirking. "Eat from there. That's all you're good for." Laughter exploded around the table. Gabriel's cheeks burned, humiliation flooding through him. But he refused to kneel and lick the floor. Instead, he tightened his fists and stared at his small portion of porridge, forcing the spoon to his lips with trembling hands. His eyes watered, not from the taste, but from the cruelty. He was learning that hunger was easier to endure than shame. After breakfast, classes began. The orphanage offered basic lessons, though the staff treated it as little more than a formality. The children sat on cracked benches, scribbling in torn notebooks. The teacher, a tired woman with little patience, often ignored Gabriel. When he raised his hand, she looked away. "Someone else," she would say. "He doesn't understand anyway." But Gabriel did understand. In fact, he absorbed every word, memorizing each phrase. He devoured knowledge silently, like a starving wolf that knew food could be snatched away at any moment. He had no toys, no family, no comfort, but he had his mind, and no one could take that from him. Still, his peers mocked him relentlessly. "Why bother, Gabriel?" Another boy sneered during recess. "You think you'll ever be more than a servant? You'll scrub floors your whole life." The insult cut deep, but Gabriel said nothing. He sat in the corner, tracing letters into the dirt with a stick, silently vowing to prove them wrong. Humiliation followed him everywhere. When visitors came, the director dressed the other children in clean shirts, combed their hair, and lined them up in the hall. Gabriel was told to stay in the kitchen, scrubbing pans so the guests wouldn't see his piercing eyes or his worn clothes. From a crack of the door, he watched families smile at the other boys and girls, his chest tightening with envy and longing. He wanted to scream, "I can love too. I can be a son too." But no one ever asked for him. One afternoon, after hours of scrubbing and sweeping, Gabriel collapsed onto his mattress, exhausted. The rain leaked through the roof, dripping onto his face, but he didn't move. He stared at the ceiling, his thoughts louder than the storm outside. If I stay here, I will rot. If I let them crush me, I will disappear forever. I must find a way out. I must survive. That spark of defiance, though small, began to grow. He started sneaking into the orphanage library, a cramped room filled with dusty, forgotten books. The shelves were crooked, the pages yellowed, but for Gabriel, it was a treasure chest. He devoured stories of heroes, leaders, and kings, imagining himself in their place. He lingered on passages about justice and fairness, concepts foreign to his daily life, but intoxicating in their promise. Of course, his secret didn't last. One evening, a staff member caught him reading by candlelight. The man yanked the book from Gabriel's hands and struck him across the face. "You think you're better than the others? You're nothing but a worthless orphan." The words echoed in Gabriel's ears long after the sting faded. That night, alone on his mattress, Gabriel pressed his aching cheek and whispered to himself, "Maybe I am worthless to them, but not forever. Not forever." His blue eyes, red with tears, glimmered in the darkness like flames refusing to die. The years stretched ahead, filled with more hunger, more chores, more cruel laughter. But with every humiliation, the seed inside him grew stronger. One day, he swore, he would stand above them all, not out of spite, but to prove that even the boy no one wanted could become someone the whole world would have to respect. The sun rose gray over the orphanage, casting long shadows across the cracked courtyard. Gabriel's body ached from yesterday's chores, yet sleep had not come easily. The cold seeped through the thin mattress, and the damp stench of the dormitory clung to his skin. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving puddles of muddy water that mirrored the hopelessness he felt inside. Breakfast was thin porridge again, served with the same deliberate cruelty. The older boys sneered, taking the largest portions and leaving Gabriel the smallest scraps. Today, Matus, the boy who always mocked him, made sure to dump his own spoonful of food onto the floor in front of Gabriel. "Eat fast, dog," he hissed. Laughter erupted around the table. Gabriel lowered his head, feeling the humiliation choke him, but he refused to swallow the floor. He picked up the meager portion in his bowl with trembling hands, pretending the mockery didn't matter. Inside, however, a storm raged. He hated that he felt small, powerless, and despised. He hated that no one saw him for more than a failure. Yet, even in the quiet humiliation, a spark of determination flickered. He would survive, no matter what they threw at him. Classes followed. The teacher, impatient and sharp-tongued, often ignored him when he raised his hand. She sighed and said, "Someone else. He won't understand anyway." The words burned, but Gabriel memorized every lesson quietly, determined not to let them define his mind. He scribbled letters in his notebook, practicing until each stroke felt like armor against the world. After lessons, chores awaited. Scrubbing floors, washing dishes, and cleaning the mold-stained walls, Gabriel felt every pang of exhaustion. His hands were raw, his knees sore, but he persisted, often under the mocking eyes of the other children. They whispered constantly, calling him useless, nobody, the orphan who will never matter. He endured, knowing that any display of weakness would only fuel their cruelty. That afternoon, Gabriel was sent to the garden to pull weeds, a task assigned as punishment for some minor perceived offense he couldn't remember. He knelt in the cold, damp soil, pulling roots with blistered hands. A few of the older boys kicked dirt at him as they passed, laughing. "Try not to choke on your own weeds," one jeered. Gabriel gritted his teeth, silence again becoming his shield. Then, for the first time, a small kindness appeared, though fleeting. Mrs. Alvarez, a substitute teacher, passed by and quietly set a fresh bucket of water beside him. "Keep going, Gabriel," she whispered. "One day, this will all mean nothing. Keep your mind sharp. You are stronger than they know." Her words struck him. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine a life outside the orphanage, a world where he was not mocked, not punished, not overlooked. But the moment passed quickly. Matus had returned and began laughing at his posture, making him feel small again. The evening brought more trials. During dinner, the orphanage director berated Gabriel in front of the other children for being slow and clumsy. The sharpness in the director's tone cut deeper than any physical punishment. Tears pricked at Gabriel's eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Instead, he focused on the promise he whispered to himself each night. "I will not be forgotten. I will rise." That night, Gabriel found a small corner in the dormitory, away from the other children. He pulled out a tattered notebook he had found in the library and began writing. Each sentence, each word, became a rebellion against humiliation. He wrote about justice, fairness, heroes, and kings, dreaming of a life where he could make a difference. His blue eyes reflected the candlelight as if flames danced within them, small but fierce. It was in that quiet, solitary moment that he began to understand something vital. While others controlled his present, he could still shape his future. Each act of cruelty against him, each humiliation, was not just pain, but a teacher. It was showing him the world as it truly was, harsh and unyielding, but not impossible to conquer. By the time sleep finally claimed him, Gabriel felt a strange combination of exhaustion and purpose. The boy who had spent mornings cleaning floors and afternoons pulling weeds had begun to forge the first tools of his resilience. patience, observation, and an unwavering desire to survive. The whispers of the other children, and the director's scorn no longer seemed entirely capable of breaking him. He drifted off to sleep with a quiet promise. Tomorrow he would endure, and someday he would rise above the cruel hands of fate, the mockery of his peers, and the neglect of those who should have cared. One day he would sit in a place of power where no one could humiliate him ever again. Night had fallen over the orphanage like a heavy curtain, suffocating the small, cramped dormitory in shadow. The sound of the wind rattling broken windows combined with the distant rumble of thunder, making the room feel colder than it already was. Gabriel lay on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Hunger gnawed at his belly, and the sting of humiliation from the day's punishments still burned his cheeks. Earlier that evening, a wealthy couple had arrived unexpectedly, hoping to adopt a child. Every child hoped to be chosen, but Gabriel knew better. Time and experience had taught him that he was always last in line, ignored, invisible. As he sat in the corner, quietly folding his thin blanket, he overheard the couple whispering to the director. "Why is he always in the back?" the woman asked, her tone tinged with disgust. "His eyes, they're too sharp. He looks troubled." Gabriel felt his chest tighten. He wanted to stand tall, to demand that someone see him for who he was, but the fear of rejection rooted him to the spot. The couple walked past, choosing another child with a cheerful smile and polished clothes. The laughter of that child's new family filled the room, a cruel contrast to Gabriel's isolation. The humiliation didn't end there. Matus, his tormentor, snatched Gabriel's worn jacket and tossed it into a puddle. "Looks like your clothes are as worthless as you," he mocked. Others joined in, mimicking Gabriel's hunched posture and trembling hands. Gabriel's blue eyes stung with tears, but he refused to cry in front of them. He had learned that showing weakness only made him more vulnerable. Once the visitors had gone, Gabriel was assigned extra chores as punishment for being unpresentable again. He scrubbed the floors of the dining hall on his knees, the cold tiles biting into his skin. Each brushstroke reminded him that he had no family, no home, no one to defend him. Yet as the hours passed, something inside began to stir, a quiet, stubborn defiance. Gabriel remembered Mrs. Alvarez's words from weeks before. "You are stronger than they know." He repeated them silently, letting them echo in his mind, letting them shield him from despair. The thought of being stronger, of surviving, became a flicker of hope amid the darkness. After chores, he retreated to the library, his sanctuary. The room smelled of dust and mildew, the shelves sagging under the weight of forgotten books. He pulled out a tattered volume about great judges and lawyers who had risen from nothing. Gabriel devoured the pages, memorizing the principles of justice, the clever strategies, and the courage it took to stand against power. For the first time, he imagined himself not as the boy mocked and ignored, but as someone who could command respect, someone who could wield power, not to hurt, but to protect and to set things right. But reality quickly returned. As he sat reading by candlelight, a shadow fell across the pages. The orphanage director's voice cut through the silence like a whip. "Reading at night, are we? Do you think books will change your place in this world? You'll always be nothing but a servant." Gabriel's hands trembled, but he did not speak. The director snatched the book, tossing it onto the floor, scattering pages across the dusty floorboards. Humiliation and fear mingled in Gabriel's chest, yet he refused to give it entirely. He bent down quietly, gathering the scattered pages, whispering to himself, "I will rise. One day I will rise." That night, Gabriel lay on his mattress and stared at the ceiling. The room was silent except for the soft breathing of the other children, some sleeping peacefully, others tossing in nightmares. He pressed his hand against his chest, feeling the rapid thump of his heartbeat. He knew that life in the orphanage would continue to test him, to humiliate him, to try to crush his spirit. But he also knew that each moment of pain, each sting of rejection, was shaping him into someone stronger. Outside, the wind howled and rattled the broken windows, and rain began to fall again, cold and relentless. Gabriel imagined himself outside those walls, standing tall, free from ridicule, free from hunger. He imagined a courtroom where his voice carried weight, where justice was not just a story in a book, but reality he could enforce. He imagined proving to everyone who had ever doubted him, laughed at him, or ignored him that he was more than they could ever imagine. As sleep finally claimed him, Gabriel whispered the vow he had carried through every hardship. I will not be broken. I will not be forgotten. One day, I will stand above it all. And with that whisper, a tiny flame of hope burned brighter than any humiliation, colder than any night, and harder than any injustice. Gabriel was no longer just a boy mocked by others. He was the boy quietly plotting his rise. Every insult, every cruel word, every rejection was a step on the path towards something greater. The journey was only beginning, and though the night was dark, Gabriel's determination had begun to illuminate the road ahead. The sun barely pierced through the gray morning sky as Gabriel rose from his thin mattress, shivering in the damp chill that clung to every corner of the orphanage. His stomach protested at the thought of another meager breakfast, but he pushed forward. The courtyard was already noisy with children shoving and shouting, jostling for attention, and carving out their tiny territories within the oppressive walls. Gabriel kept to the shadows, avoiding Matus and the others who delighted in tormenting him. Breakfast was another reminder of his place. The staff served the larger, steaming bowls to the stronger, louder children, leaving Gabriel with a shallow portion of porridge, lukewarm and thin. As he hunched over his bowl, trying to consume it quickly before anyone could further ridicule him, he felt the sharp jab of a foot at his side. "Eat faster, little orphan," sneered one of the older boys, a cruel grin stretching across his face. "Or maybe we should just leave you for the rats." Gabriel swallowed hard, tasting the bitterness of humiliation along with the tasteless porridge. He lowered his head, forcing himself not to cry, not to react, not to give them the satisfaction. Each insult was a weight he carried silently, a stone added to the pile of rejection that seemed impossible to lift. Yet beneath it all, a quiet defiance burned, invisible to everyone around him. The day's lessons were no better. The teacher, impatient and dismissive, glanced over Gabriel's exercises with scowl. "You'll never understand this," she said, tossing his notebook aside. The laughter of other students filled the room. Gabriel clenched his fists, but he did not protest. He had learned that resistance in words led only to further punishment. Instead, he concentrated, memorizing the lessons in silence, determined that one day knowledge would be his weapon. After classes, the chores began, scrubbing floors, washing dishes, and mending the worn clothes of other children. The work was grueling, unending, and performed under the constant watch of the director, whose glare made every movement heavy with fear. Gabriel's hands were raw, his knees sore, yet he endured. Each task completed was a silent victory, a step toward proving, even if only to himself, that he could survive. As he carried a heavy bucket of water across the courtyard, Mateus and a few of the older boys jeered. "Careful, you might spill your precious water, loser," one taunted. They shoved him lightly, laughing at his struggle. Gabriel stumbled, but did not fall. He felt the sting of mud on his clothes and hands, humiliation flooding his body, but he straightened himself and continued. Every step was a test of endurance. Every smirk from the others a reminder of the cruelty that surrounded him. In the late afternoon, the library became Gabriel's refuge once more. He snuck in while the staff were distracted, picking up a battered book about famous judges who had risen from nothing. His eyes devoured each page, absorbing the stories of courage, justice, and unshakable moral strength. Each tale ignited a spark in him, a vision of a life beyond the orphanage walls, a life where he would no longer be mocked or overlooked. That evening, the director caught him reading again. Gabriel felt a familiar rush of fear, but he stood his ground, gripping the book tightly. The man snatched it away, tossing across the floor with a sneer. "Do you really think reading will make you important? You're nothing," he spat. The words cut deeper than any physical punishment Gabriel had endured. But for the first time, he did not cry. He bent down silently, retrieving the scattered pages, pressing them to his chest as if to draw strength from them. "I will rise," he whispered to himself, the vow solid and unwavering. They will see. One day they will see. Nightfall brought solitude, the only friend Gabriel had. He sat by the cracked window, staring at the darkened courtyard below. Each shadow seemed to mock him, yet within those shadows, he imagined possibilities. He imagined himself older, taller, wearing the robe of a judge, commanding respect, wielding justice. The images of power and influence filled him with a strange warmth, a sense of purpose that even a harsh orphanage could not extinguish. As sleep claimed him, he repeated the silent promise that had guided him through every humiliation and hardship. I will survive. I will rise. And one day, no one will dare humiliate me again. Even in the darkness, Gabriel felt a flicker of hope. It was fragile, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Each day of hunger, each moment of shame, was shaping him, teaching him resilience. The boy who had once been mocked, pushed aside, and ignored was slowly forging the tools of survival. The first steps on a path that would one day lead him to power, influence, and recognition. The orphanage was silent in the early morning, save for the rhythmic drip of water leaking through the roof and the creaking of the floorboards under Gabriel's bare feet. He moved carefully, avoiding the gaze of the older children who had learned to delight in tormenting him at every opportunity. Today, however, something felt different. An opportunity was hiding within the monotony of their cruel routine. Breakfast was a thin, watery porridge as usual. Gabriel ate quickly, not daring to linger, while the older boys whispered and snickered. Mateus leaned over and hissed, "Better eat fast, little orphan, or I'll make sure the floor gets your portion." Laughter erupted from the table. Gabriel's stomach churned, humiliation washing over him. Yet he forced himself to swallow quietly. He had learned long ago that showing weakness only encouraged cruelty. After breakfast, the children were sent to clean the main hall. Gabriel knelt on the cold, hard floor, scrubbing stubborn stains from decades-old tiles. Every swipe of the rag burned his raw palms. The older boys walked past, tossing him small clumps of dirt and mockingly commenting on his slow pace. One even whispered, "You're so useless. Nobody will ever care about you." Gabriel pressed his face against his arm, fighting back tears, but a quiet defiance simmered beneath the surface. He knew he could not stop this abuse entirely, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could outsmart it. When the staff weren't looking, he began experimenting quietly. He noticed patterns in the daily chores, shortcuts that saved time without drawing attention. He memorized a schedule, predicted where the others would be, and used these small insights to avoid the worst of the teasing. It was a subtle rebellion, invisible to those who thought him powerless, but to Gabriel, each small victory was monumental. During a rare free moment in the library, he found a book on strategy, filled with tales of cunning leaders and clever thinkers. As he turned each page, he imagined applying those lessons to his own life. He studied the tactics quietly, devising little plans for navigating the cruelty of the orphanage. The humiliation he endured became raw material for his growing intellect. Every insult, every shove, every mocking laugh became a lesson. Observation, patience, and timing were as powerful as strength. The director noticed Gabriel's increasing focus and decided to humiliate him further. That afternoon, he demanded Gabriel clean the windows while the other children were outside playing. Gabriel's thin arms ached as he scrubbed the grime-covered glass, the sun burning weakly through the clouds. Mateus and a group of boys began flicking mud and water at him, laughing hysterically as he struggled to maintain balance. But Gabriel had learned. He subtly shifted his position to avoid the worst of their attacks, while maintaining the appearance of defeat. Each smirk and poke from the older boys only reinforced the quiet satisfaction he felt. He was surviving, adapting, learning. As night fell, Gabriel retreated to the corner of the dormitory, exhausted but resolute. He traced letters into his worn notebook, recording observations, small victories, and strategies for enduring the next day. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the mix of weariness and determination in his striking blue eyes. He thought about the future, not just surviving the orphanage, but rising above it. The humiliation he endured, while bitter, was forging a resilience no kind words could create. Gabriel understood that power did not come from avoiding suffering, but from enduring it and learning from it. When the other children fell asleep, he whispered once again, a promise to the darkness that had witnessed his pain. "I will survive. I will endure. One day they will all see me. In the quiet, he allowed himself to dream. He imagined a life beyond the orphanage walls, a life where no one could belittle him. He envisioned sitting in a courtroom, a robe of authority draped over his shoulders, his voice commanding respect. Each cruel word, each shove, each moment of isolation was a step toward that vision. Gabriel realized that humiliation had become a teacher. It forced him to study human behavior, to observe weaknesses, to understand strategies of survival and resilience. He had turned his suffering into lessons, his loneliness into reflection, and his fear into determination. That night, as the wind rattled the broken windows and the rain began to fall once more, Gabriel closed his notebook. He pressed his palm against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. The orphanage could not take away his mind, his determination, or his dreams. Each act of cruelty had made him stronger, sharper, and more focused. The boy who had entered the orphanage a year ago, small, timid, and humiliated, was evolving. He was learning to navigate a world designed to break him, transforming every insult into a stepping stone toward a future only he could imagine. The journey ahead would be long, filled with more pain and struggle, but Gabriel's resolve was unshakable. He whispered one final time into the shadows, "One day I will rise, and when I do, nothing will stop me." The morning air was thick with damp and the faint smell of mold as Gabriel rose from his thin, worn mattress. The orphanage dormitory was silent, save for the occasional creak of a floorboard and the soft whisper of wind through broken windows. Today felt different, though he couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was a quiet resolve that had been growing inside him, forged in months of relentless humiliation, hunger, and solitude. Breakfast was the usual watery porridge. Mateus and a few of the older boys snickered as Gabriel tried to eat without drawing attention. One of them leaned over and whispered, "Don't choke, little orphan. Maybe the floor will like you better than we do." Laughter erupted around the table. Gabriel's stomach twisted in embarrassment, but he swallowed in silence. He had long learned that giving them a reaction only fueled their cruelty. The morning lessons began, and Gabriel quietly observed the teacher's every word. Unlike the other children, who whispered, fidgeted, or stared out the window, Gabriel absorbed each lesson with meticulous focus. He had developed a system in his mind, connecting ideas, storing them carefully for later. It was during these quiet observations that Gabriel began to see patterns in behavior, not just the lessons themselves, but the behavior of the staff and children alike. After class, chores awaited. Gabriel scrubbed the floors with the same careful precision he had learned over the past months. His hands were raw, his knees sore, but he endured. The older boys were there, as always, making fun of him, kicking up dirt, mocking his every movement. Yet Gabriel began to notice something. The smallest adjustment in his technique allowed him to complete the work faster, more efficiently, and with less attention from the bullies. It was a small victory, almost imperceptible, but it filled him with a quiet pride. He realized that humiliation could be countered, not with defiance or shouting, but with patience, observation, and clever action. Every insult became a lesson in strategy, every shove a test of agility and resilience. Later that afternoon, while the others played in the courtyard, Gabriel snuck into the library. His small hands trembled as he reached for a book on problem-solving and critical thinking. The pages were worn, the spine cracked, but each sentence felt like a lifeline. He read about inventors, leaders, and thinkers who had overcome impossible odds. He began to scribble notes, formulating strategies not only for survival in the orphanage, but for life beyond it. As he worked, Mateus and a group of boys entered the library, laughing and pointing. "What are you doing, nerd? Reading won't save you from your place," they mocked. Gabriel's fingers froze on the page, his heart hammering. Humiliation surged, but he did not flee. Instead, he stood slowly, holding the book close to his chest, his blue eyes fixed firmly on the ground. He had learned to endure. That night, as the rain began to fall outside, Gabriel returned to his mattress, exhausted but determined. He traced the lessons of the day in his notebook, writing about strategy, observation, and resilience. He recorded small victories, such as avoiding Mateus's shove while carrying water or completing chores faster than expected. Each note was a stepping stone, each scribble a secret triumph. In the darkness, he whispered to himself, a vow carried only by the quiet of the dormitory. One day, all of this will matter. Every insult, every shove, every moment of shame is teaching me how to survive. One day, I will rise. For the first time, Gabriel allowed himself to imagine a life that lay beyond the orphanage walls. He pictured a courtroom where his voice commanded attention, a desk where decisions were made not on whim, but on justice, a life where he would no longer be humiliated or overlooked. Each vision was a beacon in the shadows, a spark to guide him through the darkness. He realized that the lessons he was learning from cruelty were invaluable. The orphanage was teaching him patience, critical thinking, and strategic foresight. Gabriel had transformed humiliation into a tool, observation into a weapon, and isolation into clarity. He understood that power would not come from brute force, but from knowledge, timing, and resilience. As sleep overtook him, Gabriel clutched his notebook to his chest, feeling the rhythm of his heartbeat steady and strong. The boy who had once cowered at laughter, who had cried silently under the weight of humiliation, was evolving into someone who could endure, adapt, and plan. He had taken the first steps toward becoming more than an orphan. He was becoming a survivor, a thinker, and eventually a man who could wield power with purpose. Outside, the rain fell steadily, washing over the orphanage and the courtyard where the children had played and mocked him. Inside, Gabriel's resolve burned brighter than the storm, a flame of determination that could not be extinguished. He was learning that the world would not hand him a chance. He would have to take it one careful, deliberate step at a time. And in the quiet, as the night deepened, he whispered again, "I will survive. I will endure. And one day, I will rise higher than anyone ever imagined." The orphanage was quiet in the early morning, but Gabriel's mind was already racing. Months of humiliation, endless chores, and constant mockery had taught him patience, observation, and strategy. Today, he sensed an opportunity, a chance to turn his endurance into action. Breakfast was the usual watery porridge. Mateus and a few of the older boys leaned over him, laughing at the small portion he received. "Better eat fast, little orphan," Mateus sneered, "before you starve to death." Laughter erupted around the table. Gabriel felt the sting of shame, but he swallowed quietly, keeping his blue eyes focused on the bowl. He had learned that reactions only gave the bullies power. After breakfast, the children were sent to their chores. Gabriel was assigned to clean the storage room, a cramped, dusty space filled with broken furniture and forgot supplies. It was a thankless task, but he saw an opportunity. Over the past weeks, he had memorized the layout of the orphanage, observing patterns, staff routines, and weaknesses in supervision. Today, he decided to test his plan. While cleaning, he noticed a locked cabinet containing school supplies and small rewards for obedient children. Mateus had often bragged about sneaking snacks or notebooks from it, and the director's lax oversight made it vulnerable. Gabriel waited until the other children were occupied, then quietly examined the lock. He had no tools, no experience, just patience, careful observation, and determination. Slowly, methodically, he manipulated the latch using a bent piece of wire he had found in the corner. His heart raced. Every noise, every shadow could betray him. Mateus and the others roamed the hall, laughing and shouting. The director moved through the main corridor, clipboard in hand, scowling at minor infractions. But Gabriel remained focused. Inch by inch, click by click, the lock yielded. Finally, it opened. Inside, he found a small stack of books, notebooks, and pencils, the kind of resources that could make a difference in his learning. Gabriel's hands shook, not from fear, but from the thrill of success. For the first time, his cleverness had rewarded him directly, proving that strategy and patience could triumph over brute force and ridicule. He carefully removed a notebook and a pencil, slipping them into his worn jacket. As he did, Mateus appeared at the doorway, smirking. "What are you doing, loser? Trying to steal something again." His tone dripped with amusement. Gabriel froze, his blue eyes meeting Mateus's. The fear and humiliation surged, but he held his ground. He said nothing, just turned and walked back to his assigned cleaning area, clutching the notebook tightly. Mateus laughed, shaking his head, but Gabriel realized that even being caught did not erase a small victory. He had learned to act wisely under pressure, to think ahead, and to turn humiliation into motivation. The afternoon passed with more chores, more teasing, but Gabriel carried the notebook with him, a secret reminder of his capability. In the dormitory that night, he opened it by candlelight, jotting down notes on observation tactics and problem solving. Each sentence reinforced a new truth. Intelligence, patience, and careful planning could overcome even the harshest obstacles. For the first time, Gabriel felt a spark of real hope. He had survived humiliation, endured relentless mockery, and quietly achieved something tangible. This small victory gave him confidence, a sense that he could influence his circumstances rather than remain a passive victim. That night, he whispered into the darkness, "I am stronger than they know. I am smarter than they expect. And one day, I will rise above all of this." He imagined a courtroom where he could wield authority, where injustice could be corrected, and where no one could ever humiliate him again. Each cruel joke, each shove, each denial of food or comfort was now fuel for his ambition. Gabriel understood that suffering did not weaken him. It sharpened him. The rain tapped against the broken windows as he closed his notebook. Outside, the orphanage courtyard was silent, the older boys asleep or resting. Gabriel felt a quiet sense of triumph, the first taste of empowerment in a life that had been dominated by cruelty. He had endured, observed, planned, and succeeded, and no one, no Matthews, no director, no one could take that away from him. Sleep came with a sense of accomplishment and purpose, the first real comfort Gabriel had experienced in months. The boy who had once been humiliated at every turn, small and overlooked, was learning the art of survival, strategy, and resilience. In the darkness, one thought burned brighter than the fear and pain of the day. This is only the beginning. One day, I will rise higher than anyone could imagine. The morning sun barely filtered through the cracked windows of the orphanage dormitory, casting long, cold shadows across the worn wooden floors. Gabriel sat on his thin mattress, his blue eyes focused on a notebook he had secretly claimed from the storage room days before. His hands were raw from chores, his stomach still empty from a meager breakfast of watery porridge, but his mind was sharper than ever. Each day, humiliation and cruelty had sharpened his focus, teaching him patience, observation, and strategy. Breakfast was the usual spectacle of dominance and ridicule. Matthews and the older boys shoved him aside as they reached for the larger portions. "Move, orphan," Matthews sneered, spilling a bit of his porridge onto Gabriel's thin jacket. Laughter erupted around the table, a chorus of cruelty. Gabriel felt a familiar sting of shame, but he forced himself to eat quietly, swallowing both the food and the humiliation. He had learned that surviving with dignity required silence, endurance, and careful calculation. After breakfast, lessons began. Gabriel's attention was unwavering as he absorbed each word, each formula, each principle. The teacher, dismissive as always, ignored his raised hands and overlooked his answers, but Gabriel wrote everything down meticulously. He had realized that knowledge was a weapon no one could take from him. Each page of notes was a stepping stone toward a future where he would never be powerless again. During chores, Gabriel faced the same torment he had endured for months. The older boys kicked at his feet as he scrubbed the floors, whispered cruel jokes, and made a game of his struggle. One boy shoved him into a pile of wet rags, laughing as Gabriel's hands were soaked and dirted. The humiliation stung, but Gabriel remained composed. He had learned to transform pain into strategy. Each shove, each laugh, each insult was now a lesson in human behavior, a clue to how power and fear worked in the world. By afternoon, Gabriel was tasked with cleaning the courtyard. He carried heavy buckets of water across the muddy ground, Matthews and others hurling insults at him every step of the way. Yet Gabriel noticed patterns in their behavior. Predictable movements, repeated taunts, moments when their attention wavered. He began to plan small acts of quiet defiance, testing his strategies for navigating humiliation without breaking under pressure. After the chores, Gabriel returned to the library, his sanctuary. There, he pored over books about justice, strategy, and critical thinking. His small victories, unlocking the cabinet, recording notes, enduring torment without reacting, had begun to give him confidence. He realized he could act cleverly, manipulate situations subtly, and survive with purpose. That evening, The director caught him once more, standing over a stack of books that Gabriel had been organizing quietly. "What are you doing? Do you think reading will make you important?" The director barked, grabbing a book and throwing it to the floor. The other children laughed cruelly, echoing the humiliation Gabriel had learned to endure. Instead of reacting with anger or fear, Gabriel calmly picked up the book, tucked it under his arm, and continued his work. Inside, a small, secret triumph had been won. He had not fled, he had not cried, and he had not allowed the director to see the satisfaction of quiet intelligence. For the first time, humiliation had not defeated him. It had made him stronger. Night fell, and Gabriel returned to his corner, writing in his notebook by candlelight. He documented each observation, each small victory, and every insight into human behavior. The humiliations, the cruel jokes, the shoves, they were no longer simply moments of suffering but raw material for his growth. Each day, each act of cruelty, was shaping him into someone capable of rising above the cruelty that had defined his life. In the quiet, he imagined his future, a courtroom where his voice carried weight, decisions made with authority, respect, and justice. He pictured himself no longer mocked, ignored, or humiliated, but as someone commanding attention, wielding power not through cruelty but through intelligence, resilience, and moral authority. Sleep approached, but Gabriel's mind remained active. The rain pattered against the broken windows. The wind rattled the walls, and the shadows of the dormitories seemed to lean in, observing him. Yet the boy who had once trembled under every insult now lay with a sense of purpose. He had endured, he had learned, and he had achieved his first real mastery over the small elements of his life. He whispered into the dark, a vow and a promise intertwined. "I will survive. I will endure. And one day, I will rise above all of this, higher than anyone could imagine." The humiliation he had endured, the cruelty he had faced, and the isolation he had felt were no longer weaknesses. They were the building blocks of his resilience. Each act of endurance, each moment of observation, each silent victory had forged a stronger, smarter, and more determined Gabriel. As he closed his notebook, the candlelight flickering over his determined face, he realized that the orphanage was no longer merely a place of suffering. It was a crucible, shaping him into someone who could endure, plan, and ultimately rise. The boy who had once been small, timid, and humiliated was now learning to navigate the world with intelligence, strategy, and quiet power. The night deepened, and Gabriel drifted into a deep sleep, a spark of hope and determination burning brighter than any fear or humiliation. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more mockery, and more obstacles. But he was ready. He had survived the worst of what others could throw at him, and he was growing stronger with every passing day. The morning sun cast weak light over the orphanage, struggling to penetrate the broken windows and gray, grimy walls. Gabriel rose from his thin mattress with a resolve that had been forged through years of humiliation, ridicule, and relentless struggle. Every cruel word, every shove, every insult had sharpened him, preparing him for this day. Breakfast was the usual watery porridge, served with an air of indifference by the staff. Matus and the older boys leaned over him, snickering as usual. "Eat faster, orphan," one whispered. "Maybe today you'll choke and we'll be done with you." Gabriel felt the sting of embarrassment, but he swallowed in silence. He had learned that his strength came from endurance, not confrontation. Today was different. Today, Gabriel had a plan. Over the past months, he had meticulously observed the orphanage routines, memorized every schedule, every crack in the floor, every oversight of the staff. Each humiliation had taught him patience. Every insult had taught him strategy, and every act of cruelty had refined his mind. The small victories of unlocking the cabinet, surviving the library confrontations, and enduring daily torment had built the foundation for something greater. After breakfast, he was assigned to clean the main hall, a task meant to humiliate him further. Mateus and the other boys jeered, kicking at his legs and mocking his every move. But Gabriel moved with quiet precision, executing the task flawlessly while noting every detail, every pattern of their behavior, every opportunity for subtle leverage. In the afternoon, an opportunity arrived unexpectedly. The director needed a volunteer to help organize the orphanage's limited legal documents, a tedious task no one wanted. Gabriel, having observed the system, understood the value of this position, accessed the knowledge and proof of capability. Despite knowing Mateus and the others would mock him relentlessly for even trying, he stepped forward, voice calm, eyes focused. The director looked surprised, then scoffed. "You? The weak, useless boy who can barely keep up with chores." Gabriel's blue eyes did not waver. "I can do it," he said quietly. His voice held no arrogance, only the calm of someone who had endured far worse. The older boys laughed, but Gabriel ignored them. He sorted papers, read through legal forms, and cataloged records with a precision that drew the director's reluctant attention. For the first time, the man's scowl was tinged with curiosity, and he allowed Gabriel to continue. As the hours passed, Gabriel's focus never wavered. The humiliation of past years, spilled porridge, shoves, mocking laughter, was now a fuel for concentration. Each movement, each note, each careful decision reflected the lessons he had learned. Patience, observation, resilience. By the end of the day, the documents were organized impeccably. The director, though still stern, nodded. "Well, you've done better than expected." The other children stared, mouths agape. Even Mateus looked taken aback, silent for once. Gabriel had achieved a small, undeniable victory, the first moment where his perseverance and intellect had forced recognition. That night, Gabriel returned to his corner, exhausted but triumphant. He opened his notebook, writing down every detail of the day, every strategy, and every insight. He reflected on the journey, the cruelty, the hunger, the relentless humiliation, and realized that every painful moment had prepared him for this breakthrough. He whispered into the darkness, a vow that carried both reflection and resolve. "I have endured, I have learned, and one day I will rise higher than anyone ever imagined." Sleep came slowly, his mind replaying the day, calculating the next steps. Gabriel knew that this small victory was just the beginning, that the road ahead would still be filled with obstacles, ridicule, and tests of endurance. Yet for the first time, he felt a sense of mastery over his circumstances. The boy who had once cowered under mockery, who had trembled at every insult, was evolving into a young man capable of facing the world on his own terms. Years later, those lessons, the endurance, the strategy, and the careful observation, would culminate in Gabriel's greatest triumph. He would leave the orphanage, armed with knowledge, determination, and a resilience built from years of humiliation. He would study law, work tirelessly, and eventually rise to become a respected judge, the very embodiment of justice and perseverance. Every child who had mocked him, every staff member who had doubted him, every moment of rejection and shame would become part of the story he could tell, not as a tale of defeat, but as evidence of triumph. Gabriel would prove that no matter how cruel the world might be, intellect, resilience, and courage could turn the harshest circumstances into a stepping stone toward greatness. In the dormitory, the candle flickered over his notebook one final time. Gabriel pressed his hand to the page, feeling the weight of his journey. The boy who had once been mocked, ignored, and humiliated was now poised to transform his life and shape the lives of countless others through his wisdom, courage, and unyielding determination. The night deepened, rain tapping against the broken windows, but Gabriel's resolve burned brighter than ever. Humiliation had been his teacher, loneliness his mentor, and endurance his weapon. He had survived, adapted, and triumphed, and as sleep claimed him, he whispered one last time, "I will rise, and when I do, nothing in this world will ever break me again."